Hi, I'm Richard Cox. I grew up in Peterborough and around the Players every summer of my life till I went off to college, and some winter months too, and came back many times thereafter to do plays. The Stearns and the Browns were family to me, as were many of the alums who I met over so many of the years. When I was 19, I did a season of summer theater on Martha's Vineyard, and I was so disoriented about the idea that I wouldn't get to Peterborough that summer that I leapt on my motorcycle, drove onto the ferry, and drove at night through the pouring rain to get to Peterborough for 24 hours. The bond is strong. When my wife Sarah and I were looking for the perfect special place to get married, Sarah had only been to Peterborough twice, but when I brought up the theater, it was an immediate, enthusiastic yes. I am honored and delighted to have been asked to read a chapter from our Playhouse. EBS was an extraordinary woman, a force of life with boundless, inspiring good energy and an invincible will to bring out the best in all of us. She was Aunt Edith to me, and I had the great good fortune to have known her well for the first 13 years of my life. She spent long summer afternoons talking to me about a million things, including what I thought of the snippets of rehearsals I saw in the barn, many of them plays my mom, Rosanna Cox, did during those magical summers that I grew up at the Players. Rosanna, or Rosie to many of you, came as an apprentice in 1939 and never left. I came when I was 1 year old, when we were living in the old Mary Arden cabins down Middle Hancock Road, and I never left. When you're a Peterborough player, you're a Peterborough player for life. EBS would drive me to town to get triple dip ice cream cones at Mike Goldman's Village Pharmacy, and half of them would melt onto the seats of the old Woody station wagon that she drove. When I was still young, sometimes my parents, EBS and Sally, would let me come into the house after a play and listen to the stories of the stage, how some funny thing had happened in the first act that took down the house, how some crazy thing had thrown the actors in Act 3. There were 3 acts in those days, but how they'd all recovered, and it was a great night. And sitting around that table would be the most incredible, eclectic group of people. In addition to the company, and maybe colonists and friends from town that might include a farmer or a professor from Harvard, there might be great authors passing through town that knew and loved EBS, like Sinclair Lewis and Thornton Wilder. There might be, a renowned physicist like Vannevar Bush, or a great astronomer. Harlow Shapley lived down the road and would point out the stars to me on the way into the house where he would visit with the company and EBS. And of course, Bob Brown was a colonel, Sally's husband, Bob. So he had a bunch of military friends who'd show up. So you could just as easily have another colonel or a 4-star general or an astronaut sitting at that table. It was quite a scene. Those were magical summers growing up in Peterborough. And when I was 7, one day, EBS and Jimmy Welsh came up to me and said, "How would you like to be in a play with your mom next summer?" "Are you kidding me? Yeah, what took you so long?" And somehow EBS had the faith to ask me at barely 8 years old to do a substantial role in professional theater. And summer after summer, EBS and Sally would come up with fun roles for me. What summers they were, putting on plays, hanging out with talented and hilarious theater folk. And when you were a teen, what could be more fun than being an apprentice or a local jobber at the Players? You were working hard and you were falling in love, but you were blessedly distracted from your heart throbbing because you had to build sets and man the light booth, and on strike night you worked all night, and Mike Goldman would bring yummy sandwiches at 2 a.m. and there'd be a show tune or two played by Robbie Weatherby, and then you get back to work, and if you finish by dawn, maybe you'd run over to New Banusset or Willard Pond and jump in the lake, and what a way to spend a summer. And it's the same way now. And it was the same way when my mom and Sally and Jim Whitmore and Johnny and Mary Kay all would run around the Players and slip down to the ice house. There was an ice house down where the old cabins were, beyond the Red House, where they preserved ice for the Coke bar in the house in mounds of sawdust. And the young actors would go down there and they'd read Balzac and Baudelaire, racy stuff, like the Dead Poets Society. When I first came to LA, I called Jim Whitmore Sr. and I wanted some mentorship, and he invited me over for lunch at his place in Malibu. And I said, what were those days like? Or just describe what comes to mind when you think of your early days as a young actor at Peterborough. And he smiled, and his eyes started to shine, and he said, "Oh, the sap was running. The torch is passed. Summer will come again, dear friends." From Dora Greenwell's poem, Song of Farewell. Edith Stearns died November 16th, 1961 in Mount Clemens, Michigan, where she was living with Sally and her family. She was 77 years old. It was sudden and unexpected. Several individuals associated with the Players recalled that they'd only recently been in contact with EBS, receiving messages of well-being and talk of the future. A memorial service that brought together a long list of Players' alumni, family, friends, and neighbors from the Monadnock region and from all across the nation was held at All Saints Church in Peterborough on November 29th, followed by a private committal service at Pine Hill Cemetery. While a profound sense of loss and grief was certainly felt by all who knew EBS, there was an equally strong outpouring of thanks and joy for having had the privilege to be associated with such a person. And there was celebration of EBS's remarkable life, one that exemplified a level of dedication, integrity, selflessness, humanity, and love which many aspire to, but few are able to attain or sustain. Many local luminaries eulogized EBS. No stage has ever felt more deeply the spiritual presence and guiding force of its founder, patron, and managing producer than that of the Peterborough Players, wrote Ellen Carman, Players actor and director of the Monadnock Theater Guild. From playwright William McCleary, those of us who had the blessed luck to work with Edith Stearns in Peterborough owe a debt to her that can be repaid only by our trying with all our hearts to create an American theater worthy of her, by our extending as far as our individual talents will permit her qualities of good taste, high-heartedness, and maternal love for all mankind. Also, Dick Noyes wrote in the Monadnock Ledger, "The editor of this newspaper is, along with probably 500 people in all walks of life and in all parts of the world, a Peterborough player. It is a condition one never gets over. It's like being a particular blood type or a graduate of Harvard, and there's no way to outlive it." And being a Peterborough player means, inevitably, being deeply indebted to a person who left this world 2 weeks ago today, leaving behind her a record of humane achievement that defies engrossment. Sally Stearns Brown, as spokesperson for her siblings Ibby Stearns Gay and Johnny Stearns, announced in the spring of 1962 that there would be no season for the Players that summer. In an interview with the Transcript, Sally indicated that although the decision was regretful, at this time the wisest course seems to be to have a year's hiatus before resuming operations. We plan to spend the next year in study and reorganization of the Players in order to reopen in 1963 on the surest possible footing. The central question must have been whether to continue the theater as a family-run operation, reorganize it as a chartered nonprofit corporation, and likely discontinue family ownership and authority, or shutter the theater for good. Unfortunately, EBS left no provision, formal or otherwise, for the disposition of the theater after her death. This was the crisis that loomed for the surviving Stearns family and the Peterborough Players in the spring of 1962. Meanwhile, a contingent of players and alumni, led by Rosanna Cox and Richard Morse, were organizing an effort of their own to help ensure the continuing operation of the theater. I should say a word about the Morse brothers. Rick and Bobby Morse were memorable players who started as apprentices in 1950. They were both in the hugely successful production of On the Town, with Rosie, my mom, playing the taxi driver. And my very first memories in this world are being held in the back of the Peterborough Players Theater, listening to audiences scream, "Encore, encore," for the "I Can Cook Too" number, and those double pianos pounding away, and the incredible energy of a hit in the Peterborough Players barn. Richard became a scholar and teacher of French literature and theater, and a very celebrated mime. The Richard Morse Mime Theater toured the world. He had directed a beautiful production of The Madwoman of Chaillot, with my mom playing the title role, which was the last production before EBS died. And while he was helping play a leadership role in discussions about the future of the Players, his brother, Robert Morse, who'd found great success on Broadway, was starring in the hit musical How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. It was always very exciting to see a Peterborough player do a play in New York, and we had many opportunities to do that with Bobby Morse on Broadway. We once went backstage to see him after True, the tour de force one-man play about Truman Capote that I hear Craig Swartz was terrific in. I wish I had seen it. We went backstage, and I asked him at one point, did you ever have the terrors during the rehearsal period about such an undertaking? And he said, yes, of course. And he turned to my mother, and he threw his arms around her and said, you know, you helped me tremendously with stage fright at the very beginning at the Peterborough Players. I was paralyzed with fear. He was doing a short Chekhov play as an apprentice. And apparently my mom took him aside and reassured him and told him that he was giving a gift to the audience that they wanted to receive, and that he was superb, and to just enjoy it and get out there and do it. And whatever she said had meant a lot to him, and he had thought about it often over the years. So Rosanna and Rick, who were in Peterborough to attend EBS's funeral, first met with Sally, Ibby, and Johnny after the memorial service. They proposed establishing a Peterborough Players alumni organization as a means of assisting in the transition and ongoing operations of the theater. Rosanna, in a statement to the transcript, called on the Peterborough community to offer the Stearns family similar support. EBS's children welcomed the show of strength and optimism, but reiterated that they had made no decisions thus far regarding the theater's future. Many editorials and local newspapers urged the Stearns family and the community to rally for the cause of keeping the theater open. Indeed, a committee of residents, sustaining patrons, and other interested individuals from Peterborough and the surrounding region was formed for the purpose of helping the Stearns family plan for the theater's future. It was not a fait accompli that the theater would continue. It took a lot of love and planning and teamwork. As one of the leaders of the New York alumni, Rosanna's first initiative was to persuade the Peterborough Committee, and more importantly, Sally, Ibby, and Johnny, to perform at least one show during the 1962 season. It would be an opportunity to pay tribute to EBS and to the audiences and patrons who supported her theater for the past 28 years. It would also provide a forum for soliciting ideas from the audience members on how best to move forward. The Stearns family agreed to the concept of performing a single play, and the town committee agreed to help with fundraising for the event. The commemorative production was scheduled for July 31st through August 4th and brought together some of the most talented and popular players who'd ever worked with EBS. Good Morning, Miss Dove, written by William McCleary, is the portrait of a dedicated teacher who has devoted her life to developing the very best in her students. The plot also reveals detractors among the school's parents and administrators who challenge her classroom decorum and instructional technique, and whom she must confront. James Welsh and Paul Bertelsen, the most accomplished and acclaimed team in the player's history, agreed to serve as director and technical director. The cast was equally impressive, including Rosanna Cox, Dick Noyes, Flo Peters, Ruth Smith, Richard Morse, Alan and Daphne Dame Carmen, Amelia Evans, Henry Franklin, Clayton Green, Rosanna's son Richard Cox, and Rob Weatherby, among others. The Stearns family was represented in the production by Ibby and her second husband Carl Gay and their son Peter, and EBS's granddaughter Drusilla Brown. It was a family affair, not just the Stearns Brown family, but the family of the Peterborough community who so loved the theater, and alumni who rushed to be part of this celebration. It was extraordinary. Special arrangements were made with Actors Equity Association so that all the professional production staff and company members in the show were allowed to perform without compensation. The Peterborough Committee raised funds to cover travel and room and board for the actors. Local businesses contributed groceries, hardware, and other goods. One restaurant even catered lunches free of charge for the company during their rehearsals. Attendance was by invitation only to recent patrons and season ticket holders, a necessary limitation given the theater's seating capacity and the abbreviated 5-night run. Admission was free. One of the most touching remembrances of EBS and her theater was written by the Reverend Alvin Kershaw, rector of Peterborough's All Saints Episcopal Church, who presided at EBS's memorial service. His words were printed in the program for Good Morning, Miss Dove. The theater opens and opens us. The opening of the Peterborough Players for this one production in 1962 is of far greater significance than providing a week of theater entertainment in a delightful setting. It is more than continuing a regional theater tradition dating back to 1933. It is more than providing a most appropriate tribute to Edith Stearns, its founder and guiding inspiration. It is the gathering again of the soul of a community of persons concerned with more than the plastic and chrome irrelevancies of life. As Mrs. Stearns well understood, the theater has a high priority role in community life. In the deadening complexity, noise, busyness, and organizational existence, the theater provides a setting for human conscience to be heard, and its basic questions of identity and meaning to be dealt with. Where preoccupations with the status and power of work so often seduces the individual into becoming an object or thing, no longer the driver but the driven, the theater reawakens the perception that the most urgent human work is growing to self-conscious wholeness as a person. Worthy drama makes us look at ourselves by forcing us perceptively and emotionally deeper and deeper to face our situation and experience in all its concrete richness and plentitude. The Trojan women's wailing grief for the human waste of war, the Macbethian destructive ambition, the Willy Loman loss of selfhood, open us up to these deep dimensions at work inside ourselves. We are at last involved deeply with whom we really are, and thus, at last, are responsible persons. Plato quotes Socrates as saying at his defense trial before the Athenians, "I tell you that it is the best thing a man can do to be applying his reason every day to the question of virtue. The unexamined life is not worthy to be lived by man." With all the cellophaned appliances our culture affords us to protect ourselves from the true weather of our lives and situation, the theater rips off our evasions, rationalizations, and self-deceptions in an aesthetic moment of discovery. The theater, in making us see ourselves, makes us see that we're less than we should and might be. Drama offers urgent discovery, without which the decisions and energies are begun from a foundation false to human fulfillment. We therefore trust that this week of theater is a bridge that keeps alive the past and points to full seasons ahead. Without that future, the region is impoverished to a depth we can ill afford to lose in an anxious time. We're living through another anxious time, aren't we? And boy, could we use some good theater. We'll be back in the barn again soon. As planned, the actors sat down with the audience after each night's performance of Good Morning, Miss Dove, to discuss what the future for the Peterborough players would hold, with Rosanna Cox and Dick Noyes leading the talks. After the play closed, Rosanna shared the feedback from the audiences with the Stearns family. There was overwhelming support for the theater to continue from both the audience members and from the players' alumni group. Many people preferred that the theater remain under control of the Stearns family, offering up ideas and plans for how to raise the necessary funds to ensure a continued successful operation. The players and the community had spoken. Now it was up to EBS's children to decide the fate of their mother's theater. Neither Johnny nor Ibby were in a position to assume family leadership of the theater. Johnny was far too involved in his television production career in California, and Ibby's husband, Carl, was not about to give up his wife or his globe-hopping career with the Ford Motor Company. And neither really had the inclination to spend the rest of their lives operating a barn theater in New Hampshire, notwithstanding the immense personal and professional sacrifices. None of EBS's surviving siblings was a viable candidate, as they had no interest or experience in operating a theater. Could EBS's children retain family ownership and hire a managing director to run the theater? Possibly, but what would be the point of a family-operated theater with no family members involved? No. If it were to continue as a Stearns family operation, then Sally was the only logical candidate to assume EBS's managing director role. She had the experience to manage the theater successfully from her many summers spent as EBS's assistant. And though a wife and a mother of three, she also had more flexibility with her time, as she didn't have a career obligation and had been able to spend many summers in Peterborough despite her husband's sometimes far-flung military assignments. Assuming that a new funding vehicle could be put in place to help finance the theater, the real question was, did Sally have the desire and the wherewithal to take up the mantle of leadership and her mother's legacy? Privately, there were more than a few people who believed the theater would not and could not reopen. EBS had so strongly defined the identity and the soul of the Peterborough Players that some individuals could not imagine the theater going on without her. Sally herself had her doubts. Said Chuck Morey, who worked alongside her for 14 years, Sally always felt an enormous obligation to keep the theater going, not only to the memory of her mother, but to the extended family of players and the community itself. But she never felt prepared to run a theater, nor did she ever really want to run a theater. In fact, she always said she never wanted to run anything. Also, she was continually pulled between the obligations to a young family and her obligations to the theater, a tension that would eventually result in her need to close the theater in 1972 for a year to reassess how she really felt about things. The question was temporarily answered 2 months later in October 1962 when Sally decided that the Peterborough Players would reopen for a full season in 1963 and beyond, with herself as managing director. The official announcement came in the form of a letter to friends, season ticket holders, sustaining members, and sponsors, in which she also outlined a plan for establishment of a capital endowment fund to assist in financing the theater, including providing scholarships to talented young people who were unable to afford tuition. Sally gave an interview to the Transcript later that winter in which she updated the public on the Players' Capital fundraising drive. She characterized support of the drive as very encouraging, noting that the support given the theater since October leaves no doubt that this area wants us to keep going. It takes a village, and it did. Sally was definitely her mother's daughter. They shared the diminutive stature, the meticulous attention to detail, and a serious and concise conversational style. Yet both could surprise one with their sense of humor and warmth. And while there were, of course, differences between the two women with respect to personality and temperament, they were mostly shades of gray. One of the differences was their decision-making process. Ibby, who had a unique perspective of both her mother and sister, observed that EBS was very impulsive, not like Sally. Sally always thought things through first. Longtime player Robert Alvin echoed this sentiment, adding, EBS was very spontaneous. She would act on impulse, but had a good sense of what would work here on this stage. She was very much the opposite of Sally in the externals. They were also different in how they perceived other people. Sally's husband, Bob, once remarked of EBS in an interview, any writer she liked was a great writer. If she liked someone, she would invent qualities for them. But Sally had no trouble dealing with human weakness. She believed that to understand all was to forgive all. Chuck Morey once said that Sally could love unlovable people. The difference was that EBS wouldn't know that that person was unlovable. Yet both mother and daughter saw and expected the best in people. Rosanna Cox observed that EBS had a grand accumulation of faith in what people were capable of. She and Sally both had that. They saw more in you than you saw in yourself. It's going to be wonderful, they would both say. Having been an assistant to EBS for so many summers, Sally easily slipped into the same managerial style as her mother, while also maintaining the hard work, focus, and dedication required to make the theater successful. The dining room in the farmhouse was still the center of life for the Players. Everyone, past and present, who was intimate with the Players had high hopes and fervent wishes for Sally and the theater going forward. The number of telegrams received by Sally wishing her a successful opening night and 1963 season was overwhelming and must have provided much-needed confidence for what was an understandably anxious staff and acting company. It was, after all, not only Sally's debut, but also the 30th anniversary of the Peterborough Players. Another reason for being confident about the upcoming season was the return of James Welsh as producing director, a role he would maintain for the next several years. Being able to rely on him for the first 3 seasons as managing director was undoubtedly a great relief. The first 3 seasons under Sally's leadership were outstanding in all respects. Almost all of the performances for 1963, 1964, and 1965 seasons were either sold out or played to near capacity audience. Sally and Jim Welsh didn't deviate from the balance of plays that had been so effective with the Players' audience over the years. They offered a good dose of the ever popular comedy, satire, and farce, but they also offered more than the usual share of drama, including the tragedy Antigone and William Saroyan's The Time of Your Life, beautiful play, which closed out the 1963 season. Paul Vincent Carroll's Shadow and Substance, and Clifford Odets' The Country Girl in 1964, and Lillian Hellman's The Little Foxes and Thornton Wilder's The Skin of Our Teeth in 1965. The Skin of Our Teeth. I get goosebumps just thinking about that production. I remember it so vividly. It's an incredible play. If you haven't read it and are a fan of Thornton Wilder's, read The Skin of Our Teeth. It's about nothing less than everything. Sometimes hilarious, sometimes profoundly soulful. I can see so vividly Ruth Smith as the fortune teller, my mom and Jerry Dempsey as Mr. and Mrs. Antrobus. I played a zany telegraph boy who Jimmy Welsh had deliver his messages as raps, many decades before rap. I can hear my mother's blood-curdling scream of her son's forbidden name, forbidden real name, Cain, because it was really the Cain and Abel story. You have these experiences of plays that stay with you forever, and that's one of them. The strong showing of the Players in the first years without EBS at the helm brought forth a great deal of respect and admiration for Sally's efforts as managing director, and went a long way toward endearing her to the patrons. Our local columnist spoke for many when she closed her 1963 review simply, "Thank you, Sally Stearns Brown." The Players suffered a grave loss in 1965 when James Welsh died. I was in his last play in Peterborough, The Skin of Our Teeth. Jimmy was an incredibly talented and hilarious man. By the way, he was the dialogue coach who directed the children in Mary Martin's famous television version of Peter Pan. He was absolutely terrific with young actors. He was survived only by his niece, who, having no interest or plans to arrange for his burial, asked Sally if Jim could be interred in the Stearns family plot in Peterborough. Sally acceded to the request, and Jim was laid to rest next to EBS in Pine Hill Cemetery. His stone was cut from the granite step of the door of the director's cabin, the cottage built by Johnny Stearns. It was a final and fitting tribute to a wonderful man. It was also the beginning of a trend whereby members of EBS's extended family of players would find eternal repose in her family plot over the ensuing years. As of this writing, there are more players buried than there are Stearns and Browns. They include James Welsh, Jerome Dempsey, Bob and Ruth Alvin, Colin Craig, and Henry and Jody Franklin. I'm sure some of you may remember the line in Act 3 of Our Town. "Yes, beautiful spot up here. I often wonder why people like to be buried in Woodlawn and Brooklyn. and they might pass the same time up here in New Hampshire. Our family plots are in Woodlawn and Brooklyn. I get it. So, save a spot for me. I acted in many plays in Peterborough during the years of this chapter that I just read, including Good Morning, Miss Dove, and the next season, Sally's first as managing director, I played the Greek paper boy who sings When Irish Eyes Are Smiling in William Saroyan's The Time of Your Life. At the beginning of his beautiful play, Saroyan writes this epigraph: "Seek goodness everywhere, and when it is found, bring it out of its hiding place, and let it be free and unashamed. And in the time of your life, live so that in that wondrous time you will not add to the sorrow and misery of the world, but will smile to the infinite delight and mystery of it." EBS lived that way. Look at this incredible theater and extended family she gave us. We're all Peterborough players for life. Lots of love, and see you soon.